This morning, the title of the message is The Way to Greatness. The Way to Greatness. And who doesn't want to be great? That's the first question I lead you with, right? All of us in some way, whether we admit it or not, or say it to our friends and family or not, deep down inside, we long to have some greatness in us. It doesn't have to be something that is visible to everyone, but I think we want to have something about us that is remembered, that is special, that is above average for sure. And in that sense, we seek greatness, right? Whether it be you want to be a great parent, or you want to be a great athlete, or a great student, right? So the kids who are in here who are in school, we don't want our kids to be average, I don't think. We want them to be great at what they do. We want them to rise to the top, to excel. And then when they become in the workforce, we don't want average, below average workers. We want for ourselves and for our kids to push forward, to be great employees, great managers, great leaders. I think that is, if we admit it, part of who we are. But the question is, what is the way to greatness? And that's what I want to explore based on the passage today. So, a couple thoughts. 3 questions that we ought to ask ourselves. I've been thinking about this for preparation. When we talk about greatness, the first thing I find myself asking is, in whose eyes do we seek greatness? Meaning, who is it that we are trying to be great to? And so if you are you're working, who is it that you seek to be great to? Sometimes that's a really important question to answer, because if we are trying to be great to the wrong audience, our contribution could very well be perceived as great, but to the wrong people. The people that maybe are the decision makers. That's why those of you who work and are in meetings and trying to get stuff done, important things done, right? They talk about understanding, what is the word? Stakeholders, right? The ones who your contributions need to really influence them, because they are, at the end of the day, the ones who will decide whether or not what you did is going to move forward or not. So as we think about our pursuit of greatness, the way to greatness, the first question I think we ought to ask is, in whose eyes? That's kind of important. Who is it that sees us for what we are trying to become, sees us for what we contribute, sees us for what we're trying to do? A second question to ask: by what measure? By what measure? So, those of us who are trying to be good parents, great parents, not just good, great parents, that's a worthy aspiration. So in addition to in whose eyes do we want to be seen as great parents, well, by what measure? Because depending on how we answer that, that in some sense sets the course for how we push them, how we encourage them. If the measure, for example, and I'm just using parents as an example, if we use academics as the measure, then we push them towards academics. If we see sports as the measure, success in sports, then we're definitely going to be pushing and encouraging them towards athletics, right? And so, what measure are we using to determine greatness? If it's personal greatness, how does the world measure greatness? I noticed that we have a lot of lists in society. Magazines put out top 10 lists, top 50 lists, and those who are ambitious seek to make it to the top of that list. Maybe you have a list where you work. They recognize 1 through 10 and 1 through 50 or whatnot. And for you, maybe your measure of greatness is that you've bought into that this is important and I want to be on that list. So what is the measure by which greatness is given? That's the second question to think about. And the third one I think that I was thinking about is, when it comes to greatness, what is the cost? At what cost? So everything comes at a cost. It costs very little to be average and below average, I think. You just let nature run its course, and everything will revert to, what's the term? Revert to the mean, right? It's just by default. If you just let things be as they are, things just sort of, they actually won't even be average. They'll actually just decay, right? Just how nature is. Just leave it be, no cost. And so greatness, I do believe, comes at a cost. Because you are pushing to be distinct, above. And so, what is the cost to get there? It is, for personal greatness, if you look at it from the perspective of work ambition or career ambition, it's going to cost you time. It's going to cost you, for sure, if you want to go to get a good education, it's going to cost you quite a lot of money. For those of us who pursue advanced degrees, it's going to cost you your youth. You spend your first 30 years of life in school before you finally emerge from the cave of education, I call it, and then you peer out and the world has changed, and you wonder what has happened, and you start at that point, right? But all greatness comes at a cost. It's very easy to look at those who, think about who do you consider to be great in your life? Okay. It's easy to look at them and say, oh, I would love to have the rewards of their greatness. Because we look at the things on the outside. We look at maybe the things that they have, the friends that they have, the places they go, whatever they post to the social media. We see those things, and it's very easy to want to be like that. But what we rarely see is what was the cost for them to get there. Right? We don't know about the hours and hours and hours of personal sacrifice that they've made in order for them to rise to where they're at. So, those are the three things that, as I was thinking through this message on greatness, those are the three things that I find myself asking. In whose eyes, by what measure, and at what cost? So that brings us then to the message of the passage. So we turn to the book of Matthew, chapter 18, verses 1 through 4. And as we go through this passage, let us think about those three questions. Right? Let us think about in whose eyes, by what measure, and at what cost. Now, Matthew chapter 18, verses 1 through 4 is an account that I found interesting because the topic is actually covered in other accounts in the gospel, but there's something unique about this that caught my attention, and I'll share that with you. Let me go ahead and walk us through what's going on here. So, beginning with verse 1. At that time, the disciples, they came to Jesus, and they said to Jesus, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" All right, let's just stop there. So what's going on? So Jesus has a group of people that spend a lot of time with Jesus. And they see what Jesus does. They hear what he teaches. They follow him around, and they also notice what? They notice what other people are, how they're responding to Jesus as well. So they're building up this library of information, and they figured out this Jesus is someone special. He's wise. He can perform miracles. He's compassionate. And they feel like they are following this teacher who they believe is given by God, blessed by God. So if this teacher is one who is anointed, that's a better word, then why not follow this one? Because he's connected to God. I think that's the mindset of the disciples, is that we're onto something here. And what's interesting is the topic that they are concerned with, these disciples. Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, it doesn't say it in this version, but there are other accounts in the Gospels, particularly in Mark and Luke, where the disciples are actually arguing amongst themselves as to which amongst them is the greatest. And I find that interesting because you can see that there's ambition, even amongst those who are spiritually minded, right? Their connection ultimately is to want to please God who created the universe, to be right with God. And so they have attached themselves to this Jesus who seems to be able to teach about God with authority, with wisdom, with deep understanding. But then at the same time, they have ambition within them, that amongst themselves they are discussing, well, I wonder if Jesus likes me more. Kids do that, right? Who's the favorite kid? That's kind of, if you have any siblings, that for sure is a topic of conversation. Who does mom like more? Who does dad like more? This is just natural. But among 12, they were thinking, who then is greatest? Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven? And we continue in verse 2. And he, this is Jesus, he called a child to himself. There was a child nearby. He called the child to himself and sat the child, him, among them. So the child was a boy. So the child is now amongst Jesus and the disciples. And Jesus said, "Truly, I say to you, unless you change and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." That's an interesting choice of words. Now, what is going on here? And what makes this passage interesting? What I found is interesting is that there are several accounts in the Gospels I've mentioned before that talk about the disciples arguing about who is the greatest. Those of you who have been to Bible studies and church before, you can sort of remember that these passages are out there. There's one in Mark chapter 9, one in Luke chapter 22. There are also passages talking about Jesus welcoming the children. What's interesting about the Matthew account is that this is the only account of all the ones where they're talking about, the disciples are talking about greatness, where Jesus welcomes the children. This is the only account where it has Jesus, it records Jesus saying this specific phrase, which is, "Unless you change and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven." So for some reason, the Matthew account, the author of this, chooses to emphasize something that Jesus says and highlights it. And it causes me to go, why did Matthew focus on that part of what Jesus said? Why did he focus on change? The disciples are talking about wanting to be great. And Jesus says, okay, well, let me tell you some truth about greatness. He says, unless you change and become like children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. So then, I was thinking that Matthew is written to an audience. So the one who's writing this is trying to tell something, communicate something to the audience. And who is the audience? Well, Matthew is written to Jewish Christians, those who culturally understand very, very deeply what it means to be Jewish. So, me not being Jewish, I can't relate to Jewish culture because I didn't grow up that way. Right? But from what I understand about Jewish culture is that they grow up knowing the law of God. Right? And the history of Israel is that they follow God of creation, and through even times of immense suffering in Egypt, where they were made into slaves, the God who created the universe was faithful and delivered them and loved them, even in times when the people were not appreciative, is that the right word, of what God had done for them in the past, even when the people disobeyed, yet God loved them and continued to chase after Israel and their culture is that God revealed through Moses the law, the wisdom and the guidance that was meant to reveal what God was like and what God expected from his people. It was, instead of having to guess what God is like, instead of having to guess at what God is looking for, he made very clear to his people, this is what I expect of you, and that you are to be a light to the nations. You are to love me, God, and to love your neighbors, right? This is the essence of what God's law was about, and the people of God were supposed to reflect that. And the culture is that they were to be familiar with the law, there's also ritual, right? They had Passover ritual to remember what God had done. Very steeped in their daily routine and their activities. And so as I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking, it's really interesting that the Matthew account was talking to Jewish Christians, points this out, this point here about change. And my conclusion is this. I think one of the reasons why the Matthew account has this, maybe, and he's aware that in the audience, those who are used to routines, those who have traditions, it's very easy to become so attached to your traditions and your routines that you are unwilling to see truth that is being revealed to you. Especially as you get older, we just don't really want to change, because what we know, and this is just a human nature, I think, our human nature, is that once we settle into something that is our routine, whether it's good for us or not, it's just hard to change. And so I think the author of Matthew is pointing this out to his audience, that Jesus does say this, is that greatness does not come from those who sit still and say, I'm just going to be this way, take it or leave it. That the disciples were asking about greatness in the kingdom of heaven. Well, greatness comes with change. The word here for change is actually, in the original language, is to turn. Like the direction that you're going in is not the right direction. You need to turn and go in a different direction, which a lot of times is just really hard to do. We could be going the wrong way, like literally driving down the highway, and we're trying to get someplace, and I don't know if you've ever done this before, but you know you're going the wrong way, and for some reason we convince ourselves that, no, I'll get there eventually if I just keep going this way, and it takes a fight, or Google, or someone saying, no, you need to exit and take a different route, because you are not going to get there. I don't know what it is about us. Is it pride, stubbornness, whatever the reason? But unwillingness to change will never get us to greatness. And I was thinking about the terms we use in the workplace, at least when I was working corporate. We use words like adapt, be nimble. The software team used agile, a lot. Okay. And then for startups, there's this word pivot. Okay, we have to pivot now. Okay, well, what does that mean? All these are like cool ways of saying we were wrong. Our original focus is not going to get to where we thought we were going to get. Like, pivot, what is that all about? Like, we're running out of money, and if we don't change soon, there is no company. That's basically what it is, I think. So in the world of work and projects and whatever it is that you all work on at work, I mean, it's not an uncommon idea. It requires, well, first of all, someone has to be able to say, well, we're going in the wrong direction. We're not going to be able to get there at the rate we're going or at the direction we're going. But there needs also then to be a willingness, so that actually takes a lot, because no one wants to admit they're wrong, right? And the hard part then is actually doing it. So there is actually wisdom in this passage, even though this is a kingdom of heaven discussion about greatness within the kingdom of heaven. Is very specific, but I think there is wisdom in terms of what does greatness require? I think what Jesus is saying is, number one, we do need to see that if we're going in the wrong direction and we're not heading towards greatness, that we need to be able to say, I'm not going in the right way. I need to change direction. And what does that mean? He says, if we continue in the passage, he says in verse 4, because he's talking about you have to change, and in this context, he says you have to be like children. And that's a very interesting, there's a child that comes. It's a very interesting analogy. So what does that mean to become like children? I'm sure the disciples were thinking, wait, what? You want me to change and become like this child? So what does that mean? Well, Jesus explains it in verse 4. He's not talking about physically becoming like children. He's not talking about becoming childish. He's not he's not saying to act like a child. But he says, whoever will humble himself like this child, he is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. That's much more specific, and it does give us some insight in terms of what did he mean at that moment then. What is the change that he was telling the disciples? If you want to be great in the eyes of God, here's what is necessary: to be humble like this child. Now, what does that mean, to be humble like a child? How humble is a child, really? Really? Yeah. Sorry, kids, but, what does that really mean? So we have to kind of think through, well, okay, this is really important. If this is the secret, that we need to change, we need to shift our direction. And Jesus is saying, to be great in the eyes of God, we need to be humble like a child. Well, I think there's a couple things that it could mean. A child is dependent on the parents. They are, generally speaking, unable to fend for themselves. Maybe for a few hours. But generally speaking, without the parents, kids are lost, right? And they completely depend on the parents for their life. To feed them, to clothe them, to bathe them, to put them to bed. And they don't even know when to go to sleep. They'll stay up all night, if they could. So as an adult, I think it's very easy for us to feel like once we get the education and the means, like, we got this. I got this. I'm good. We're dependent on nobody. I don't need to depend on anybody because I got a great job, got a great house, my family's good. We got it all, right? But to be humble like children is to remember, well, who is it all from, really? I think is the remembrance that it comes from God the Father, which is kind of hard as you get more successful in life to be able to do that. I think it gets hard because you feel good that, hey, you've spent all this time, you got educated, and you have a good job. You feel like, hey, I did this. And so even though Jesus says, yeah, just be like a child, the reality of what he's asking for is actually not easy. So this is the dilemma. Disciples, they're arguing over who is great. And I think when we go back to then, what are the things we should think about greatness? In whose eyes, by what measure, and at what cost? I think the disciples were looking around and they were following Jesus and they're looking at all the other folks in their community who are, I'll say religious, right? Who are trying to be right with God. And they were mostly concerned about being great to one another and to their peers. Now, that was the first thing that I think is going on. They were thinking, we're following this Jesus. I think we got the right guy. We are going to be great in front of everybody. And by what measure? Why did the disciples even get to the point that they were thinking that they were all that great? Well, because they were there with Jesus when he's doing all this cool stuff. Healing people coming up. Like, who doesn't want to be around someone with that magnetism? It's like some of you work at pretty cool companies, right? And you feel good because, hey, I'm working at this hot company, and you feel good about that, right? And so the disciples were kind of, I think, feeling the same way. It's like, wow, we are for sure on the top 10 list. And so they feel proud of themselves. So by what measure did they feel great? I think is by the things that they were doing, by being affiliated with the right person. And Jesus says to them, unless you change and become humble like these children, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so, I need to wrap this up soon. I'm going to give you two examples of what this looks like, and we'll wrap it up. The first example I'm going to pull is from the book of John, chapter 5. So if we can go to that. Jesus is talking to religious folks who are very religious. They're well respected in the community. But he's very critical of them for this. And he says to them in John chapter 5, beginning with verse 37, the Father, he says, this is the Father, he's talking about God. God who sent me, he has testified about me. And what Jesus is saying is that in the scriptures, that there are writings that point to him, someone who is coming. But he criticizes the religious folks. He says, you have neither heard his voice at any time nor seen his form. Also, you do not have his word remaining in you because you do not believe him who he sent. See, the scriptures were pointing to a king who would come, a king who would be a deliverer. This was the Messiah that Israel is waiting for. And he's saying that they do not believe the one in front of them, who's Jesus. In fact, in verse 39, he says, you religious folks, you examine the scriptures. This is the Torah, the writings, the law. You examine them, meaning they're deeply studying the scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. Like they were going about it, trying to find wisdom and meaning, and the rabbis were the ones who would teach from this. And they were going about it thinking that was what was going to give them eternal life, make them good with God. And Jesus is saying, it is those scriptures that testify about me, and yet you are unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. Here we have religious folks who thought greatness was being able to reveal from the scriptures insights and wisdom on God, and that this was what would give them eternal life, when in fact, the scriptures were pointing to one who was great, who was to come, who would save them. And for some reason, they were unwilling, these religious leaders, they were unwilling to change. They were unwilling to go from the course that they were following and shift to see that, in fact, the one who was before them, this Jesus, was the very one that the scriptures that they were experts in was pointing to. And it's tragic. On the other hand, we have another example in Mark. There is one his name is John. John the Baptist, they called him. He too was Jewish. But John the Baptist appeared in the wilderness preaching a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And all the country of Judea was going out to him. And all the people of Jerusalem, they were being baptized by him in the Jordan River. Because in the Jewish custom, there was this custom of once God forgave sins, as part of that symbolism, they would go into the river and be washed. And so John was doing this. That's how he got the name John the Baptist. It's so funny. We think of baptism as a Christian thing. No, this was a Jewish tradition to be washed, to be cleansed by God. And so they were being baptized by John the Baptist in the Jordan River, confessing their sins. And John was clothed with camel's hair and wore a leather belt around his waist, and his diet was locusts and wild honey. Interesting guy in that sense. But verse 7, and he was preaching, saying, after me one is coming who is mightier than I, and I am not fit to bend down and untie the straps of his sandals. I baptize you with water, but he will baptize you with the Holy Spirit. See, John too understood that God was, through the scriptures, going to bring one who would save Israel. God understood that he was going to bring a king to deliver. So he had the same expectation as well. He says it right here. After me, one is coming who is mightier than I. He is doing this with great expectation of the king who was promised. But what's interesting about John's response is the following. And you can see it in this passage in John. Let's go to John chapter 3. So what happens is a matter of dispute develops on the part of John's disciples. So John is baptizing folks, and he's got followers because like, wow, this John is something special. I want to follow John. And a dispute arises with John's disciples, with a Jew about purification. We don't know what that dispute was about, but they're having a dispute. And they came to John and said to him, Rabbi, he who was with you, this is Jesus, beyond the Jordan, to whom you have testified, behold, he is baptizing, and all the people are coming to him. So basically what's happening is John's disciples are upset because they're not as popular as this guy over here who is baptizing. Okay? So I don't know, ego is being bruised, I don't know what it is, but they're more popular. Nobody likes someone else who's more popular than they are, right? So that's what's going on here. But look what John's response is. And this speaks to the heart of change that Jesus was talking about. See, when the religious people saw all the people going to Jesus, they got upset. And they didn't like Jesus because of that. It's like, wait, my power is going away because they're all going to this Jesus guy. Whereas John's response, when there's competition, in verse 27, John replied the following. A person can receive not even one thing unless it has given to him from heaven. You yourselves, he's talking to his disciples, are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Christ. John, in his humility, recognizes that he is not the one. He is not the Messiah that was spoken about in the Scriptures. And it took an act of humility to recognize, look, if I am not the one, and he is the one, then he is the one who should get the glory. And so that's why he's telling his disciples, look, it's okay. He says, you yourselves are my witnesses that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent ahead of him. He who has the bride is the groom, but the friend of the groom who stands and listens to him rejoices greatly because of the groom's voice. John is saying, I am not the groom. I'm the friend of the groom. So when the groom shows up, it's okay. Just be joyful that we are part of this. And that's why John says, so this joy of mine has been made full. He must increase, but I must decrease. John's response when the attention goes to Jesus is so different than the response of the religious elite when the attention goes to Jesus. That act of humility is the ability to know that the glory belongs to God. God was promising that this king would come to save Israel. And when this Jesus appeared, the act of humility to change was to say that, you know what? I can't do enough on my own to be right with God. I need to be like a child and trust that what God has provided is enough to save. And the religious people couldn't do it, but John had the humility, and he could do it. And that is, my friends, the beauty of the gospel. Is that we have a limit to what we are able to accomplish. We might be great in one thing in our lives, I don't know, education, parenting, your work, you pick. But it comes at a cost. A lot of times we're great in one thing, and it comes at a cost that we're not so great in other things. Maybe we're great at work, but our personal life is a mess. Or maybe our personal life is great, but our work is a mess. You can't win. And when it comes to being right with God, none of us are perfect. Why should God accept us, a God who is perfect? And so when it comes to greatness in front of God, I don't know. We don't have enough to pay for it. And that is the beauty of the gospel, is that this Jesus who came, he could pay for it, and he did. And so the cost was borne by him. And those like John who knew that, they had the heart of a child. And they were humble enough to realize that it wasn't them who was going to save. It was this Jesus. And so too, we who want to be great in the eyes of God, this might not be the case for your work or school or being a parent, but if you want to be great in the eyes of God, he's saying that we need to change. And the change that we need to have is to be humble like a child. Is to realize that the way we've been going about it, to be right with God, it always can be tweaked. Especially those of us who've been in church for a long time. We think we've got it down, we got our routine. Actually, there's always room for change. Always room to revisit the way we think about things and the way we go about things, the way we do, discipleship. Maybe we need to kind of reflect on how can we do things differently, because it's going to be the battle inside is to not want to do anything different. We've got this. This is how we've always done it. But those who want to be right with God, what he's saying is the humility before God is really important. And to trust the Father, to trust God, and we will have to turn in some way from the direction we are going. But the price has already been paid. The cost to us has already been borne by Jesus on the cross. And so, in that sense, the huge weight has been lifted already. It is a matter of whether or not we are willing to change and to turn to God and say, God, I don't know, but you've done it already through the cross, and avail yourself to him. Show me the next step. Show me what to do next. I don't have the answers. Find friends and family amongst us to bring us along for guidance. I think that's part of what the faith community is about. So as we go, let's hit the 3 questions to think about. First question is, what kind of greatness are you after? And we're all pursuing something. So what is it? What kind of greatness are you after? My hope is that in your list is greatness in the kingdom of heaven. I think disciples actually had a good ambition. Is to be right with God, and for God to be the one who is pleased above all things. The second question is, what needs to change in you to get there? This is the harder question. If you say nothing needs to change, this is the perfect message for you. Because it takes some introspection. Maybe, I don't know, ask your spouse. What needs to change in me? That's a hard question to ask. But ask God to show you what needs to change in you to get there. Especially those of us who are more seasoned. I think the tendency is to say, well, it's been working for me, whatever I've been doing, so I don't need to change anything. And that's kind of when we're in danger. And then finally, third question, what would an act of humbleness like a child look like? So if, in fact, what Jesus said is true, that the change he's looking for is this humbleness like a child, what does that actually look like in your life? I don't know. So one of the things I have a hard time with is, like saying sorry. Like, you teach your kids to say, you got to teach your kids to say, I'm sorry, right? So for me, that's hard. I don't want to look like that. It's important, So I pray for you that you will be great. I want all of you to be great. And I pray that God will show you in what way to change.